The room felt colder than it should have been, even though the lights were bright and the benches were packed. Every cough echoed. Every shuffle of paper sounded louder than normal. People had come expecting spectacle, and they were not disappointed. At the center of it all sat a man who had spent his life surrounded by comfort, protection, and certainty. Today, he had none of those things. His suit was tailored perfectly, but it could not hide the tension in his shoulders or the way his fingers kept pressing together, over and over, as if trying to steady himself. He had always believed courtrooms were predictable places. You hired the best people, paid the highest fees, followed the rules, and walked out untouched. That belief was unraveling fast. Across the aisle, the opposing side looked relaxed. Confident. Almost amused. They whispered to each other, smiling, already acting as if the outcome was settled. Their confidence stung more than the accusations themselves. Fraud. Deception. Abuse of power. Words that had never stuck to him before now hovered in the air like a bad smell no one could ignore. When the judge entered, the room stood. The gavel struck once, sharp and final, and the trial moved forward. Questions were asked. Statements were read. Every word felt heavier than the last. Still, he remained calm. He trusted the man seated beside him. The lawyer had been with him since the beginning, reassuring him through late-night calls and private meetings. "This is solid," he had said. "They don't have what they think they have." That confidence had carried him this far. Then something changed. It was subtle at first. A hesitation. A pause that lasted just a second too long. The lawyer flipped through his papers, not with purpose, but with nervous energy. He cleared his throat more than once. When the judge asked a direct question, the answer came slower than expected. The man at the defense table leaned slightly closer. "Is everything okay?" he whispered. The lawyer didn't meet his eyes. The judge spoke again, firmer this time, asking whether the defense was ready to proceed. The room waited. Cameras clicked softly. The man felt a tight knot form in his stomach. He had felt fear before, but this was different. This was the fear of losing control in front of everyone. The lawyer stood. For a brief moment, the man thought this was it. A strong response. A confident argument. Something to remind the court that he wasn't alone. Instead, the lawyer adjusted his jacket and said calmly, almost casually, that he was withdrawing from the case. The words didn't register at first. They floated, disconnected, meaningless. Then the room reacted. Gasps. Murmurs. Someone laughed under their breath. The man turned fully toward the lawyer, disbelief spreading across his face. "What do you mean you're withdrawing?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. "You can't just walk away." The lawyer finally looked at him, but there was no reassurance in his eyes. Only distance. "I've been advised that continuing would not be in my best interest," he said. "I'm sorry." Sorry. The word felt insulting. Before another word could be spoken, the lawyer gathered his belongings. Papers went into the briefcase. The zipper closed with a sound that felt louder than the gavel. Without another glance, he walked away from the table, past the rows of spectators, and out the door. The silence left behind was unbearable. The judge frowned, clearly displeased, but not surprised. "Sir," he said to the man now sitting alone, "you understand this puts you in a very difficult position." The man nodded slowly. His mouth had gone dry. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. On the other side, the opposing attorneys leaned back in their chairs. One of them shook his head with a smile that carried no kindness. Someone whispered, "Looks like the money finally ran out." The man clenched his jaw. He had never felt smaller. The judge explained his options. He could request time to find new representation, but there was no guarantee it would be granted. The court's schedule mattered. Efficiency mattered. The law moved forward whether he was ready or not. As the judge spoke, the man's gaze drifted away from the bench, past the lawyers, past the rows of people who had come to watch him fall. That was when he noticed the janitor. He had seen him earlier, of course. Everyone had. A man in a worn uniform, pushing a mop along the edges of the room, careful not to interrupt. Invisible in the way working people often are in places like this. The janitor had kept his head down, focused on his task, moving quietly between moments of drama. Now, he wasn't moving. The man didn't know why his eyes stayed there. Maybe it was because everything else felt hostile. Maybe it was because the janitor's presence felt strangely steady, like an anchor in a storm. The janitor stood near the back, hands resting on the handle of his mop, watching the proceedings with an expression that wasn't curious or entertained. It was focused. Intent. The judge was still speaking when the sound cut through the room. A chair scraped against the floor. Every head turned. The janitor had stepped forward, leaving the mop behind. He straightened his back, shoulders squared, and raised his voice just enough to be heard. "I will defend him." The words hit the room like a dropped glass. Laughter broke out almost immediately. Not loud, but sharp. Disbelief mixed with mockery. The judge stared, clearly thinking he had misheard. "Excuse me?" the judge said. The janitor took another step forward. His hands were rough, marked by years of work. His face showed age, but not weakness. "I said," he repeated, "I will defend him." The man at the table turned slowly, his heart pounding. For a moment, he thought this had to be a mistake. A joke. Some kind of misunderstanding. But the janitor's eyes met his, and there was nothing playful there. Only certainty. The judge's expression hardened. "Sir, this is a courtroom. You are out of line." One of the opposing attorneys laughed openly now. "This is getting ridiculous," he said. "Does the court plan to let maintenance argue next?" The janitor didn't look at them. His attention stayed on the judge. "That man has been abandoned," he said calmly. "And he doesn't deserve it." The judge raised his gavel. "You will sit down immediately or be removed." The room buzzed with excitement. Phones were lifted discreetly. Whispers spread like wildfire. The man at the table felt his chest tighten. He didn't know whether to feel embarrassed, angry, or grateful. All he knew was that something unexpected was happening, and it was happening fast. The janitor didn't sit. Instead, he took one final step forward, standing fully in the open, no longer hidden at the edges of the room. "I know this case," he said. The judge paused, gavel hovering in the air. And for the first time since the lawyer had walked out, the man felt something he hadn't felt all morning. Hope. The judge lowered the gavel slowly, not striking it, just holding it as if weighing what to do next. The room was no longer buzzing with laughter now. It had shifted into something sharper. Curiosity mixed with irritation. People leaned forward, sensing that whatever this was, it was no longer ordinary. "You will explain yourself," the judge said, voice controlled but strained. "Now." The man who had stood from the back did not rush to speak. He took a breath first, deep and measured, as though he had learned long ago that words carried more weight when they were not rushed. He looked around the courtroom once, taking in the faces. The polished shoes. The tailored suits. The raised eyebrows. The quiet judgment already forming in people's minds. "I understand how this looks," he said. "I really do." A few snickers followed. Someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Then sit down." The man at the defense table felt heat rise to his face. He wanted to disappear. The humiliation was unbearable. First his lawyer had walked out on him, and now this. A janitor stepping forward, drawing even more attention, turning him into a spectacle. Part of him wanted to shake his head, to signal for the man to stop before things got worse. But something held him back. Maybe it was the steadiness in the janitor's voice. Or the way he didn't flinch under the judge's stare. The judge spoke again. "You are not licensed to practice law in this courtroom. You are disrupting proceedings." "I'm not asking to practice," the janitor replied. "I'm asking you not to let a man be crushed because his lawyer decided to protect himself." That struck something in the room. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. "Be careful," he warned. "You are walking a very thin line." On the prosecution's side, one of the attorneys stood up. Your Honor, this is highly inappropriate. This individual is not a party to this case. He's not qualified to speak, let alone interfere. The janitor finally turned toward the prosecution. His gaze was direct, unafraid. You're right, he said. I'm not a party to this case. But I've been listening to it. That drew laughter again, but it was weaker this time. You expect us to believe, the attorney said, that someone pushing a mop around this courtroom understands complex financial litigation? I expect you to believe, the janitor replied calmly, that truth doesn't care who delivers it. The judge raised a hand to silence the room. Enough, he said. You've had your moment. Sit down. The janitor didn't move. The tension snapped tight. Two uniformed officers near the wall shifted their weight, ready to step in if needed. The man at the defense table swallowed hard. He had no idea where this was going, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next would follow him for the rest of his life. The judge leaned forward. Why are you really doing this? He asked. Why insert yourself into a situation that clearly does not involve you? The janitor looked at the man at the table, then back to the judge. Because I recognize what's happening, he said. And because I've seen it before. That caught the judge's attention. Seen what before? A case built to look airtight, the janitor replied, while the real story sits just outside the frame. The prosecutor scoffed. This is nonsense. Then it should be easy to prove me wrong, the janitor said. The room went quiet again. The judge exhaled slowly. You have one chance, he said. One sentence. If it doesn't justify this interruption, you're escorted out. The janitor nodded. The timeline you're using to accuse him doesn't match the ownership records you submitted. The words landed differently than everything else had. The prosecutor stiffened. That's false. Is it? The janitor asked. Because the documents you entered show transactions occurring after the company changed hands. The judge's gaze snapped to the prosecution. Is that accurate? The prosecutor hesitated. Just for a second. But in a courtroom, a second is an eternity. Your Honor, the prosecutor said quickly. Those details will be clarified during closing arguments. The janitor shook his head. They won't, he said. Because they can't be. The man at the defense table felt his pulse quicken. This was no longer embarrassing. This was dangerous. And somehow, the janitor was walking straight into it without fear. The judge's tone changed. It softened, just slightly. Explain what you mean. The janitor clasped his hands together. The accusations rely on the idea that he was still in control when the financial decisions were made, he said. But the records show he wasn't. That's a matter of interpretation, the prosecutor snapped. No, the janitor replied evenly. It's a matter of dates. A murmur spread through the spectators. The judge looked down at the case file in front of him, flipping a page. The janitor continued, his voice steady now, stronger. I'm not guessing. I've seen the paperwork you didn't think anyone else noticed. The prosecutor's face hardened. You have no access to privileged documents. The janitor met his gaze. You'd be surprised what people leave behind when they assume no one is watching. The judge straightened in his chair. Are you claiming you have evidence? I'm saying, the janitor replied, that the story you're telling isn't complete. The judge tapped the gavel lightly against the bench. Not to call order. To think. The man at the defense table leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing? He asked the janitor. You don't have to do this. The janitor didn't look back at him. Yes, he said quietly. I do. The prosecutor stood again, anger now replacing confidence. Your Honor, this has gone far enough. This man is exploiting the court's patience. The judge held up a hand. Sit down. That command changed everything. The prosecutor hesitated, then obeyed. The judge turned back to the janitor. If I allow you to continue, he said, you will speak only to facts. No theatrics. No speculation. The janitor nodded. That's all I've ever relied on. The room felt different now. The laughter was gone. The mockery had drained away. What remained was uncertainty. The judge looked at the man at the defense table. Do you object to this individual making a statement on your behalf? The man didn't hesitate. No, he said. His voice cracked slightly. I don't. The judge studied him for a moment, then nodded. Very well. A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. The janitor took one small step forward, not triumphant, not proud. Just focused. You accused him of hiding money, he said, addressing the court. But you never proved he had access to it when it moved. The prosecutor opened his mouth to interrupt, but the judge raised a finger. Let him finish, the judge said. The janitor continued, each word deliberate. You assumed silence meant guilt. You assumed power meant control. And you assumed no one would look closely enough to question your assumptions. He paused, letting the silence stretch. You were wrong. The judge leaned back in his chair. And the man at the defense table realized something with chilling clarity. The case he thought was over had just begun to change. The room felt heavier after those two words landed. You were wrong. No one laughed this time. No one whispered. Even the quiet sounds people made without realizing it, the tapping of a foot, the rustle of clothing, seemed to fade. Every eye in the courtroom stayed fixed on the man who moments ago had been nothing more than part of the background. The judge shifted in his chair. He had seen confident defendants, dramatic attorneys, even emotional outbursts, but this was different. This was order being challenged by someone who was never supposed to speak at all. You're making serious claims, the judge said carefully. If you continue, you will be held to the same standard as any officer of this court. The man nodded slowly. I understand. On the prosecution's side, tension crept into every movement. The lead attorney sat rigid now, jaw tight, pen frozen between his fingers. Confidence had drained from his posture, replaced by calculation. He was no longer performing for the room. He was thinking. The man at the defense table felt his heartbeat pounding in his ears. For the first time since the trial began, he leaned forward instead of shrinking back. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he understood enough to know this was not an accident. This man knew something. Something dangerous. The judge gestured with a slight movement of his hand. Proceed, he said. The janitor took a breath. Not nervous. Not rushed. It was the kind of breath taken by someone who had waited a long time to speak. You built your case around intent, he said, addressing the court, not the prosecution. You told this courtroom that financial decisions were made deliberately, with full knowledge and control. He turned slightly, angling his body toward the judge. But intent only exists when authority exists. The prosecutor jumped to his feet. Objection. This is legal argument. The judge didn't even look at him. Sit down. The word landed like a blow. The prosecutor froze, then slowly lowered himself back into his chair. A low murmur rolled through the spectators. The man continued. You presented transaction records, he said. Emails. Approvals. Signatures. He paused, letting the list settle. But what you didn't show was who actually had the power to make those decisions at the time. The judge flipped through the case file again, slower now. You assumed, the man went on, that because his name was still associated with the company, he still controlled it. That assumption is supported by documentation. The prosecutor snapped, unable to hold back. The man turned toward him calmly. Outdated documentation. The prosecutor stood again, face flushed. This is outrageous. The judge raised a hand. You will remain seated. The prosecutor obeyed, but his eyes burned. The man reached into the pocket of his jacket. A few people gasped, unsure of what he might pull out. Slowly, deliberately, he removed a thin stack of papers. They were worn at the edges, creased from being folded and unfolded many times. I'm not guessing, he said. And I'm not speculating. He stepped forward and handed the papers to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. These are copies, the man continued, of internal transfer approvals and ownership confirmations. Dated. Signed. Filed. The judge studied them, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. The room held its breath. These show a complete transfer of operational control, the judge said slowly, reading aloud. Effective months before the transactions in question. The man nodded. Exactly. The prosecutor stood abruptly. Those documents were never entered into discovery. The man met his gaze. That's because you didn't want them to be. A wave of tension surged through the room. The judge looked sharply at the prosecution. Is that true? The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it. His confidence cracked, just slightly, and that was enough. The man continued, his voice steady but firm. You built a story that required silence. You relied on complexity to hide a simple truth. The judge leaned back, eyes still on the documents. Where did you obtain these? The man hesitated for the first time. Not because he was afraid, but because the answer carried weight. I used to work cases like this, he said, before I stopped wearing a suit. The words landed softly, but the effect was explosive. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Heads turned. People leaned toward each other, whispering. The man at the defense table stared openly now, disbelief etched across his face. The judge's voice sharpened. Explain. The man straightened his shoulders. I was an attorney, he said. For a long time. The prosecutor laughed bitterly. Convenient. I lost my license. The man continued unfazed. Not because I broke the law. Because I refused to. That silenced the laughter. I defended people no one wanted to defend, he said. And I challenged institutions that didn't like being questioned. The judge watched him carefully. And now you clean courtrooms? The man nodded. Yes. There was no shame in his voice. Only fact. The judge was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. And you kept copies of these documents? I kept records, the man replied. Because truth has a habit of disappearing when it's inconvenient. The prosecutor stood again, voice rising. Your Honor, this is absurd. This man is admitting to possessing documents illegally. The man turned toward him. No, he said calmly. I'm admitting to remembering what you forgot. The judge raised the gavel, not to strike, but to still the room. Enough. The courtroom fell silent. The judge looked at the man at the defense table. Did you authorize these transfers? Yes, the man said immediately. I sold control. Completely. And after that? The judge asked. Did you have authority over the company's finances? No, he replied. None. The judge turned back to the documents. Then to the prosecution. You told this court the defendant acted with full control, the judge said. These records directly contradict that claim. The prosecutor swallowed. We believe the transfers were symbolic. The man shook his head. Belief is not evidence. The judge nodded slowly. The tension in the room shifted again, this time unmistakably. What had begun as humiliation had turned into momentum. The man at the defense table felt his chest tighten, not with fear now, but with something close to relief. The judge addressed the court. This changes the framework of the case. The prosecutor's shoulders sagged slightly. The man continued, pressing forward while the opening remained. You framed him as powerful because it made him easier to blame, he said. You assumed wealth meant control forever. He paused, then added quietly. It doesn't. The judge closed the file and looked up. The court will take a brief recess, he announced. I will review this evidence thoroughly before proceeding. The gavel struck. As the room erupted into whispers, the man at the defense table finally turned fully toward the janitor. His voice trembled when he spoke. Why are you doing this? The man looked at him, eyes steady. Because I know what it looks like when a story is designed to end before the truth can speak. The defense table felt less lonely now. And everyone in that courtroom understood one thing clearly. This trial was no longer following the script anyone had expected. When the courtroom doors opened again, the air felt different. Not lighter, but sharper, as if everyone inside understood that something irreversible was about to happen. People returned to their seats more quietly now. No laughter. No careless whispers. Even the cameras outside seemed to wait with restraint, sensing the shift. The judge entered and took his seat without ceremony. His expression was unreadable, but the stack of papers in front of him had grown thicker. He adjusted his glasses and looked out over the room, letting the silence stretch just long enough to command attention. "This court has reviewed the additional materials," he said slowly, "and the implications are significant." The man at the defense table held his breath. His hands were clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Across from him, the prosecution sat rigid, faces tight, eyes fixed forward. Gone was the earlier confidence. Gone were the smiles. The judge continued. "The central argument of the prosecution rests on the assumption that the defendant maintained operational control during the period in question." He paused, eyes dropping briefly to the documents before lifting again. "That assumption is not supported by the evidence." A murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced by a raised hand. "The records submitted," the judge said, "clearly indicate a complete transfer of authority prior to the alleged actions." The prosecutor stood abruptly. "Your Honor!" The judge cut him off. "Sit down." The command was final. The prosecutor obeyed, shoulders slumping just slightly, as if the fight had drained out of him. The man at the defense table felt his chest tighten, emotions swelling faster than he could control. He had imagined this moment in fragments during sleepless nights, but he had never truly believed it would arrive. The judge leaned forward. "This court will not proceed on speculation," he said. "Nor will it punish a man for actions taken by others under a false narrative of power." The room was completely still now. "Therefore," the judge said, voice steady, "all charges against the defendant are dismissed." For a split second, nothing happened. The words hung in the air, unreal. Then reality crashed in. The man at the defense table exhaled sharply, as if he had been underwater and finally reached the surface. His hands trembled. His eyes filled before he could stop them. He lowered his head, overcome, shoulders shaking as months of fear released all at once. Behind him, someone gasped. Another person whispered, "Unbelievable!" The prosecution gathered their papers in silence. No arguments. No protests. The story they had built had collapsed under its own weight. The judge lifted the gavel one final time. "This court is adjourned." The sound echoed, sharp and final, sealing the truth in place. As people stood and began to move, the man at the defense table remained seated for a moment, as if afraid that standing might undo everything. When he finally rose, he turned instinctively toward the man who had stood when no one else would. The janitor stood quietly near the aisle, hands folded in front of him, eyes lowered. He looked no different than he had at the start of the day. Same uniform. Same worn shoes. Same calm presence. The man crossed the distance between them in a few unsteady steps. "I don't even know what to say," he said, voice breaking. "You saved me." The janitor shook his head gently. "No," he replied. "The truth did." The man swallowed hard. "My lawyer walked away. Everyone assumed I was finished." "People often confuse silence with guilt," the janitor said, "and power with permanence." Around them, reporters were already pushing closer, voices rising, questions spilling over each other. "Who are you? How did you know? Are you going to represent him now?" The janitor raised a hand slightly, not to command attention, but to quiet the moment. "I'm not here for that," he said. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, pressing it into the janitor's hand. "If there's anything I can do," he said urgently. "Anything at all." The janitor glanced at the card but didn't look impressed. "Keep it," he said softly. "But you don't know me." The man shook his head. I do. Everyone walked past me today. You didn't. The janitor met his eyes, steady and unflinching. I know what it feels like to be abandoned in a room full of people. That stopped the man cold. For a moment, the noise around them faded. The janitor's voice lowered. I've stood where you stood, he said. And I remember what it cost me when no one spoke up. The man nodded slowly, understanding dawning. You lost everything. I lost a title, the janitor corrected. Not my purpose. The reporters surged closer, cameras flashing now. Sir? One called out. What's your story? The janitor turned slightly, positioning himself between the man and the crowd without thinking about it. Today isn't about me, he said. It's about what happens when assumptions replace facts. Security began guiding people toward the exits. The courtroom emptied in fragments, conversations buzzing, the shock still fresh. At the doorway, the man paused and looked back. Will I see you again? He asked. The janitor picked up his gloves, slipping them back on. Maybe, he said. Or maybe you won't need me. The man hesitated. You could come work with me, he offered. Any position you want. The janitor smiled, just barely. I already have work, he said, gesturing lightly to the mop waiting near the wall. The man frowned. After everything you did? The janitor's voice was calm, grounded. Justice doesn't stop being important just because it isn't glamorous. They stood there for a moment longer, two men from opposite ends of the world, bound by a single moment where truth refused to stay quiet. As the man finally turned and walked out into the sunlight, the weight on his shoulders felt gone for the first time in months. Behind him, the janitor returned to the empty courtroom. He moved slowly, methodically, cleaning the same floors that had just witnessed a story no one would forget. Before pushing his mop forward, he paused, looking once more at the judge's bench, now empty. He spoke quietly, to no one in particular. Sometimes, he said, the most powerful defense isn't money, or titles, or reputation. He dipped the mop into the bucket and began his work. It's someone willing to stand up and say, I will defend him, when everyone else walks away.